gentlemen, kind people of the audience, honorable judges, distinguished opponents, as the first speaker of the affirmative team, I would like to welcome everyone to today's debate. The debate sentence states the U.S. should not have returned the Holy Crown to Hungary in 1978 as it meant the legitimization of the Hungarian political system and its leaders. We strongly agree with this statement and we are very keen to prove that today. Although first I must give you a thorough definition of the keywords and concepts by the Cambridge Dictionary to make sure our points are made accordingly. To return is to give something back to where it came from. Legitimization is the act or result of making something legitimate, as in considered reasonable and acceptable. A leader is a person in control of a group, a situation, or as in here, a country. As a political system, politics is the activities of the government, members of lawmaking, organizations, or people who try to influence the way a country is governed. The Holy Crown is the Holy Crown of Hungary, also known as the Crown of Saint Stephen, and was the coronation crown used by the Hungarian kingdom for most of its existence by Wikipedia. Hungary is a country in Central Europe. We looked at the proposition from different perspectives. Then we would like to discuss our point from constitutional, political, and cultural aspects. Let me start from the political perspective, the one we find the most important. At the time of the mid-20th century, Hungary was a communist country, and the United States did not want to return the crown to such regime. Based on Tibor Glant's article of the Crown's journey back to Hungary, published on Rubicon, it would absolutely go against the American idea of liberty and peace embedded in their constitution. As the crown had previously been used to crown the past kings of Hungary, returning it at the time of the Kádár regime would have meant the coronation of Kádár as well as accepting him as a rightful leader and acknowledging his political system too. In this respect, this was just like legitimizing him and his actions in Hungary. It was totally unacceptable as he was associated with repressing the 1956 revolution. On to our constitutional aspect, we had to understand that the return of the Holy Crown entered into a political debate of the US, and after President Carter's decision, it has become a hot issue what the president might or might not do. Based on the Dole versus Carter read at justia.com, on December 23, 1977, Robert Dole, a United States Senator from the state of Kansas, filed an instant action seeking to enjoin delivery of the Holy Crown and coronation regalia to the People's Republic of Hungary on the ground that such action, undertaken by the President without the prior advice and consent of the United States Senate, constitutes a violation of Article 2, Section 2 of the Constitution of the United States, which confers upon the President the power, by and with the advice and consent of the Senate, to make treaties provided 2/3 of the senators present concur. The plaintiff's argument is premised upon his factual assertion that the subject of custody of the Holy Crown was by tacit agreement of the American and Hungarian authorities deliberating on test from the text of the Paris Peace Treaty of February 10, 1947, in order to prevent the Soviet Union, a co-signer of the treaty, then occupying Hungary, from asserting any claim of right to possession thereof. According to the plaintiff, the American and Hungarian authorities not only agreed that the Paris Peace Treaty would be silent on this subject, they also tacitly agreed that 1. The United States would retain custody of the coronation regalia until such time as Soviet troops were withdrawn from Hungary, and 2. Return of the regalia would be effectuated only after negotiation of an appropriate treaty between the United States and the legitimate Hungarian government at some future date. The plaintiff contends that this silent agreement is an integral part of the Paris Peace Treaty of 1947 that cannot be varied or modified without the Senate. The plaintiff presented no evidence that agreements of the kind in question here are traditionally concluded only by treaty. Finally, the agreement here encompasses no substantial reciprocal commitments by the Hungarian government. As a matter of law, the court is therefore persuaded that the President's agreement to return the Hungarian coronation regalia is not a commitment requiring the advice and consent of the Senate under Article 2, Section 2 of the Constitution. And finally, our cultural aspect is that the Holy Crown is an artifact symbolizing freedom, which arrived to America as a treasure to be saved and secured from the hands of the enemies of Hungary. The United States is a country endowed by their creator with such unalienable rights that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, had to protect it at all costs. The crown was restored and put into the military base of Fort Knox. As the third and fourth issue of the Hungarian Jog Történeti Szemle newspaper states, the returning meant that it could lose its sacred meaning, or even worse, the leaders in Hungary might want it to be destroyed. Then wouldn't it have been better to let it stay in Fort Knox? There are tons of relics and artifacts in the Louvre in Paris, which belong to different countries. Then why would this be any different? After introducing our list of arguments, I would like to state that we are still convinced that the US should not have returned the Holy Crown to Hungary in 1978, as it meant the legitimization of the Hungarian political system and its leaders. Thank you for your attention, and we are eager to hear the other team's standpoint.
Can you elaborate on how keeping the Holy Crown doesn't also go against the American Constitution of peace and liberty?
Yes, well, it wouldn't, because the crown is the symbol of Hungary as a nation, and America has always been the land of democracy. So to them, keeping the crown would mean a mission of democracy against a communist and atheist government, and that is in harmony with their constitution.
It is my great pleasure to welcome the respected judges, diverse opponents, and the faculty members and the audience. I, Christoph, hereby humbly express my thanks for your interest about our topic. As previously stated, I'm hereby standing against the motion, and if I have your permission, I would like to begin by stating the debate sentence. The US should not have returned the Holy Crown to Hungary in 1978, as it meant the legitimization of the Hungarian political system and its leaders. As the opposing team, we argue the fact that it was an essential move from the US government to return the Holy Crown back to Hungary and to point out some of the disadvantages. We could not accept the exact definitions of the affirmative team, especially the ones in connection with the Holy Crown, because Wikipedia is not a reliable source. We would like to re-clarify them. The definitions are collected from the Merriam-Webster dictionary. Holy, exalted or worthy of complete devotion as one perfect in goodness. Crown, a reward of victory or mark of honor. Legitimized, to make legitimate as unacceptable. The Holy Crown of Hungary, the national symbol of the Hungarian people and culture. Our arguments are based on political, cultural, and social facts. At first, speaking of the social drawbacks. As hoped, the return of the crown was both an occasion for improving US-Hungarian relations and a device for pulling Hungary towards the West. It allowed the traditional warm relations between the two countries to resurface. Before the First World War, the two countries managed a diplomatic relationship as the migration of Hungarians to the United States increased, establishing significant Hungarian-American communities by maintaining their own culture, which led to the creation of consulates in both countries. However, the communist takeover of Hungary froze the relations, and the relationship became argumentative and critical. But after the return of the Holy Crown, it began to improve. Even so, according to the website of Embassy of Hungary in Washington and Hungarian-American relations. In December 1981, the US and Hungary signed an agreement of a two-year program of cooperation and exchange in culture, education, science, and technology. On account of this agreement, in 1989, President Bush announced the opening of Hungarian-American Enterprise Fund. This contributed to Hungary's change of political system because according to US Department of State's article about US relations with Hungary. After the collapse of communism in 1989, the United States provided assistance and support for Hungary's gradual transition to democratic state and free market economy. Moving on to our next criteria, cultural, President Carter felt that it was only right that the crown to be returned before a whole generation of Hungarians came of age without understanding its symbolism, as it was the country's most powerful symbol. The crown belongs to Hungarians. The United States only got a hold of it because of historical event which doesn't justify ownership, although it was to be guarded because of the fear of Soviet Union's reach. It never meant that it shouldn't be returned. President Carter recognized this and based on US Embassy in Hungary's article about the return of the Holy Crown of St. Stephen. He also acknowledged Hungarians' human rights deserved recognition, meaning that they had their rights for their national symbol and because of the US could not have held it back from returning. The Holy Crown is now not only Hungarian symbol, but also a symbol of freedom, self-determination and free authority of all the slaves of Eastern and Central Europe. This symbolism also emphasized in the Basic Law of Hungary, verified by the NIPA S in National Institute of Public Administration, referring to the Holy Crown. Our final perspective, political, Jim Carter thought the crown's rightful place is Hungary. The sooner the crown arrives to Hungary, the more time he has to calm the upcoming internal political storm down until the 1980 elections. Before Carter became president, returning the crown would create tension between the people of the United States, especially the Hungarian immigrants who did not want the crown to be returned, as it would lead them to vote on Gerald Ford rather than Carter. But in 1976, Carter won the elections and had already decided on returning the crown. The sooner that could have happened, the more time he would have to win back the people and ease the increasing pressure from this matter before the 1980s presidential elections. Thank you for your attention.
Thanks for your interesting speech, but how could you prove that the return of the Holy Crown had any significance on the general public of Hungary?
The crown was exhibited in the National Museum of Hungary. People could view it daily, and this hype resulted in the rock opera called Stephen the King. It's an integral part of Hungarian culture. Good afternoon. I would also like to welcome everyone. Being the second speaker of the affirmative team, I wish to elaborate our ideas. But before I come to my arguments, let us first have a look at what our opponents have said and let me give our rebuttals. Firstly, such consequential decisions about a historical treasure should not be based on emotions, it should be on the basis of rational and supporting facts. Secondly, returning the crown to Hungary is not contrary to the rules, that is why it is not unconstitutional. Thirdly, using the rock opera Stephen the King as an example is also worthless, as it had a great impact on the crowd, and this also leads to emotional decisions. And now I will back our arguments with date and intriguing details. First, the political perspective. Cardinal Mixanti applied for asylum at the American Embassy in 1956 and remained there until September 1971. It was in connection with his departure that the possibility of issuing crown jewels was first raised, but Cardinal Mixanti strongly objected to even the idea with President Nixon and the Vatican. So the White House separated the two issues, leaving the fate of the Holy Crown to be settled later. Another example is the division of the emigrant became evident after the decision, while the prominent Hungarian immigrants and scholars supported the repatriation organizations such as the Hungarian American Federation and the Hungarian freedom fighters of the world, led by András Pogány, actively attacked Carter and the Hungarian emigrants who supported the decision. This leads me to our second aspect, which is the constitutional. As my teammate also said, if the fate of the Holy Crown is implicitly part of the 1947 Hungarian peace treaty, the President alone cannot decide on its return, but only with the involvement of the Senate. A subcommittee of Congress held a stormy hearing on the Holy Crown. The debate was decided by Ferenc Nagy, Béla Károly király, who openly sided with the President, the same Ferenc Nagy, who had opposed the return of the Holy Crown in 1947, now asked the President to send it home. On the floor of the 95th Congress, many people again spoke out against the return of the crown. One of the most vehement protesting was Congresswoman Mary Rose Ocker, who wanted to see the President only with the permission of the Congress decide the fate of the crown. Her 1977 bill to protect the crown was not adopted. In 1975, the 49th Congress of the United States of America expressed its opinion that the Holy Crown of Saint Stephen should not continue to be held in the custody of the United States until Hungary is restored as constitutional state through free elections. They justified their position by stating the Holy Crown is an exceptional treasure of constitutional importance, constitutional national treasure, which in 1945 was under the protection of the USA. Hungary currently is an atheist communist regime, which could have an interest in destroying the Holy Crown. The third one, and now let me support our arguments from the cultural point of view. The special art treasure is one of the most valuable items in the history of all Europe. It has an invaluable intrinsic value. It has to be protected and safeguarded. However, besides this priceless piece of Hungarian and European history, the entire cultural life should be protected. István Deák, historian and professor at Columbia University, continued his research in Hungary on an IRX scholarship until he was accused of espionage by the Hungarians in 1973 and expelled from the country. IRX was then wanted to withdraw its exchange program in Hungary, but the State Department decided to keep the matter quiet as not to damage the already slowly improving cultural relations. So from these examples, we can clearly see why the US should not have returned the Holy Crown to Hungary in 1978. It meant the legitimization of the Hungarian political system and its leaders. Thank you for your attention.
What evidence can you present that if the US returns the crown, it will lose its significance and its symbolism?
Well, let's start with the word holy. It was not even used at that time. In addition to this, Trianon was also a taboo topic which counters the meaning of the crown, the Hungarian nation. With this in mind, it's irrational to return the Holy Crown.
Good afternoon, everybody, and now to see what arguments have been made by the opposing group about whether the American government should not have returned the Holy Crown. Their first argument was that at the time of the mid-20th century, Hungary was a communist country, and János Kádár saw the return of the crown as a matter of legitimacy. In contrast, we believe that the decision by President Jimmy Carter to return the crown in 1978 took political courage. President Carter made his decision based on the evidence that Hungary's record of human rights, its tolerance of religious expression, its facilitating of travel and communication, while definitely not perfect, deserved recognition as an example to other Soviet bloc countries. Hungary was the happiest Barak where the Kulás communism flourished. This argument is reinforced by the US Embassy's website. This gesture by America did not legitimize Kádár's policy, as the American side was only willing to handle the coronation badges under very serious conditions, such as the crown was returned to the Hungarian people and not to the representatives of state power. So János Kádár could not be present at the presentation ceremony. Furthermore, it was forbidden to transport the crown to Moscow and had to be exhibited in the National Museum in Hungary. We could hear that after 1947, US-Hungarian bilateral relations deteriorated badly. In contrast, as hoped, the return of the crown was both an occasion for improving these relations and a device for pulling Hungary towards the West. It allowed the traditional warm relations between the two countries to resurface. Beatrice Kemp, who is an editor of American Diplomacy, an online journal, also believes that finding ways to deploy common historical memories to strengthen relationships is a good diplomatic tactic, a strategy. Our opponents argued that the return of the crown has also caused domestic turmoil in America. While that is right, that is correct, the matter was brought before Congress, and this shows how important a domestic political issue it has become. But in December of 1977, the case was taken to court with two legal complaints and constitutional arguments to prevent the return of the crown. In the Curtis versus Carter case, it was declared that the crown had become the property of the United States and that the president had acted unconstitutionally in deciding to return it without the approval of Congress. The court refused to issue a preliminary injunction. It ruled that the return of the crown jewels is a political matter for the Foreign Office. The other legal case, which was it was Dole versus Carter. It was made clear that the Paris Peace Treaty included an implicit agreement that the US and Hungary would settle the matter after the withdrawal of the Soviet occupying troops. So the president acted unconstitutionally by not allowing the Senate to participate. The court ruled that there was no implied agreement in the 1947 Peace Treaty that the United States would hold the coronation jewels until Soviet troops withdrew from Hungary. So, in conclusion, both cases ended with the conclusion that President Carter had the right and the authority to decide the issue. We also must respond to the fact that the majority of the 1956 refugees were against the return of the crown, but the crown is the country, they said. It's true that the country is a symbol of national unity and was in the custody of the United States with the understanding that it would be returned to the Hungarian people, but its continued US hold created an uncomfortable atmosphere and is an obstacle to the development of bilateral relations. And finally, how the return of the crown has affected Hungarian-American cultural relations. Our opponents mentioned, I believe, the Deák affair. We would rather emphasize Marta Rajkova's opinion, which can be read in the Jogtörténeti Számla of, I think the issue was 2013. It said that after the Deák affair, the State Department decided to keep the matter quiet so as not to damage the already slowly improving cultural relations. Géza Pálfi also agreed in the Szent Hazatér that for years after 1978, the Holy Crown was the subject of studies, academic works and popular literature, and it made a fundamental contribution to the demise of the Kádár regime. Interestingly enough, almost everyone from academic circles, especially those who dealt with history and culture, said that the regalia should be returned, and the resultant good feeling enabled the first Fulbright grants in 1979. So from these examples that I provided, you can clearly see why the US should definitely have returned the Holy Crown to Hungary in 1978. Thank you very much.
I found your points fascinating, but how do you think that returning the crown didn't legitimize the Kádár regime?
Well, I feel like it needs to be said that Kádár could not be present at the ceremony, as the US wanted to introduce and legitimize democracy to a Soviet satellite state. Good afternoon, everybody. But first, to sum up our arguments on why the sacred crown should not have been returned. At the time of the mid-20th century, Hungary was a communist country, and János Kádár saw the returning of the Holy Crown as a matter of legitimacy. Though Hungary was the happiest barak where the Gulag communism flourished and the human rights situation in Hungary was more favorable than in other socialist countries, but it was far from perfect. That's why the Brzezinski-led National Security Council opposed the idea. He argued that it's a big mistake to make a unilateral gesture to a communist country, and politically active immigrants also totally rejected the possibility of giving it back. Essentially, they considered the gesture to be the coronation of János Kádár. we must emphasize that after 1947, US-Hungarian bilateral relations deteriorated badly. The Prime Minister Ferenc Nagy in 1946 and then again next year in 1947 explicitly asked the Americans to continue to keep the Holy Crown in their own custody. There was a case where the Hungarian communist leadership used the crown issue for political blackmail. In 1949, American businessman Robert Vogler was arrested in Budapest, charged with espionage and sabotage, and was sentenced to around 15 years imprisonment. The United States finally succeeded in obtaining Vogler's release in 1951 in exchange for certain political concessions. Rákosi then also asked for the Holy Crown as ransom, but to no avail. The story of Cardinal József Mindszenty, who was the Archbishop of Esztergom, also contributed to the negative US-Hungarian relations. He explicitly asked the Americans to continue to keep the Holy Crown in their custody. The return of the crown has also caused domestic turmoil in America. In fact, the entire opposition stressed that the Hungarian Crown Guards had put the crown in the protection of Americans, which is a symbol of freedom and sovereignty for Hungarians all around the world. And the United States, as a country founded on the very own principle of freedom, has the duty to protect and preserve it. Before the 1976 election, it was feared that if around 20% of the immigrant voters from Eastern Europe who naturally opposed the return of the crown voted the other way, then Ford would become president instead of Jimmy Carter. We can also criticize the president for announcing the news on the 4th of November, which was the anniversary of the bloodshed of the 1956 revolution and the swearing in of Szálasi in 1944. As my teammate also said, the matter was brought before Congress, and this shows how important a domestic political issue it has become. In 1975, the 94th Congress of the USA declared that the Holy Crown of St. Stephen should remain in the custody of the United States until Hungary was restored to a constitutional state with a freely elected government. Hungary was then under the rule of an atheist communist regime, which could have an interest in the destruction of the crown. That's why Congresswoman Mary Rose Oker wanted the president to have to obtain congressional approval before deciding the fate of the crown itself. In our view, Carter's disrespect for the crown as a symbol of freedom and sovereignty, his decision to do so is a compliment to the communist regime and thus contradicts his own program, his promises, and one of the fundamental principles of the USA, the belief in freedom. As well as the return of the crown, which not only embodies the Hungarian nation as a whole, but also provoked fierce protests in the Hungarian immigration, as they are also aware that where the crown is, there is the country, a popular saying at the time. And now let me finish our arguments from a cultural point of view. The Holy Crown is indeed an art treasure that needs to be protected. At the same time, the whole cultural life needs protection. It's enough if you remember the story of Christian Dad, which was mentioned before. Moreover, if we look at the crown not as a symbol, but as a work of art, then several questions arise. Who owns it, for example? The Hungarian kingdom ceased to exist, so they definitely do not. According to Antal entry, the communist government is not the legitimate successor to the Hungarian kingdom, and therefore the Holy Crown is not its property. On this basis, all objects in the Louvre or the British Museum, for example, should be returned to the country from which they originated. So from these examples, I hope you can see why the US should not have returned the Holy Crown to Hungary in 1978, as it meant the legitimization of the Hungarian political system and its leaders. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon. As the third speaker of the opposing team, I would like to emphasize the main points we made in this debate and also summarize our arguments. But before that, there are some clashing points which have to be cleared. First, we have to acknowledge that eventually the Holy Crown was returned to Hungary in 1978, and it did not legitimize Kádár. In fact, just about 10 years after, Kádár was replaced by Miklós Németh as a prime minister, and Hungary experienced multiple reforms, as we can read at the article on the Kádár regime at Britannica.com. Two, the claim of letting the Holy Crown stay in Fort Knox was supported by the fact that the Louvre in Paris holds many artifacts from various countries. But this is too vague. We are talking about the national jewels, the coronation insignia of Hungary. Then again, the United Kingdom, for example, keeps their crown jewels in their homeland too. Plus, considering the United States act upon liberty and justice for all, which is an excerpt from the US Pledge of Allegiance, they shouldn't keep something which is not in their ownership, as they accidentally received the crown through a historic event, which doesn't justify they had the legal basis to judge about not returning it. Politically speaking, the decision of the return of the Holy Crown was made by President Carter in recognition of the Hungarian human rights. The crown is a national symbol. They should return it unconditionally, as legitimately it belongs to Hungary. Even if receiving the crown was intended for guardianship, keeping it or holding it back from its homeland represents captivity, undermining the idea of liberty and justice. Again, returning the crown will allow the bilateral relationships to resurface and improve, leading to Hungary's pull to the west, establishing a democratic government. The return of the Holy Crown by the US had significant conditions. János Kádár could not be present at the event. Moreover, the crown couldn't be transported to Moscow and had to be put into exhibition at the Hungarian National Museum. Constitutionally, although this case was taken to court twice, by Dole and by Curtis, the court ruled out both complaints. In Carter versus Curtis case, the court stated the matter belonged to the Foreign Office. In the Carter versus Dole case, the court examined the treaty and revealed that there wasn't any implication regarding the US to hold back the Holy Crown until its withdrawal of the Soviet Union. Last but not least, as from the cultural perspective, even if the Deák affair could be criticized, the cultural relations were already improving upon the return of the crown. It sparked inspiration to rise in various areas, such as literature, with the creation of Stephen the King, a Hungarian rock opera. In conclusion, we still firmly believe the USA made the right decision to return the Holy Crown. Thank you for your time.